Hello, my tutorial today is about a product called Lift Ink. And just like the name says, it lifts ink. In this case, you can see a card that I've made. You'll be seeing the actual card front as I make it in this tutorial. And here we've used a couple of different type colors of ink, a magenta pink and a lavender purple, and actually there's a bit of metallic gold in there as well. And we've used a stamp to lift away the ink after we've put it down and expose the impression of the stamp, except that you're seeing the impression in white instead of in a darker color as we would ordinarily think of stamping. And the card, of course, has a couple of embellishments and a sentiment on it. But we'll get started and I'll show you what's needed. In this case, I used an alcohol blending solution. This is a Ranger product. I also used a lavender rather Art C alcohol ink, and there's Marabou alcohol ink, and that color is magenta. I also used a mixative in gold, another Ranger product, and that's why I used a blending solution, because I'm using a metallic, and I'll explain that in a moment. This is isopropyl alcohol. I use a 91% solution, and I use it for this project, I put it in that little bottle, which I'll show you more closely later, and that's the alcohol lift ink, which comes in a stamp pad form. The stamp we're going to use is by Tim Holtz. It's called Glorious Garden, a very large stamp. It's going to actually be larger than the substrate that we're using today. We'll also need a couple of clean paper towels, a brayer or roller or whatever you call it. If you have one in your craft room, you could use a glass jar as well, or just your hands, but I just find something that's like a brayer is helpful. This is a stamping platform. The one I'm using here is Tonic. It's a Tim Holtz stamp platform, and I've made sure that it's on the rubber stamp setting because that's the type of stamp we're using. And the substrate is this craft plastic in an opaque white. It's made by a company called Grafix, Grafix. And I've cut those 12 by 12 sheets into 4 6 by 6s. I've affixed this one to the Lazy Susan you see it sitting on with a piece of painter's tape that I've rolled into a loop with the sticky side out. And I've covered my Lazy Susan, which you don't have to have, but I've covered mine in press and seal. A lot of people ask about that. It cleans up easily, which I'll show you later in the tutorial. And the bottom side just shows you it sort of folds in on itself and sticks. It's not super sticky, but it sticks to itself, so it works really well. And to start, what I'm going to do is bring out the alcohol blending solution, and the reason I'm using this is it has a resin in it. It works well if you're using a metallic like the mixative that we're using in gold. And I've put a generous amount on the substrate, not too much. And I start shaking that gold mixative, and it needs to be shaken a lot. And in the meantime, I'm putting down just random amount of the lavender, and then I'll bring out the magenta. And I will open this ink the wrong way. Most inks open up by unscrewing the top. Marabou has a different system. And so I put that back on, say no to myself, and remind myself just to pop off the lid with my thumb. And it has a very tiny opening that I create in each of the bottles with a pinhole. So very different than other ink systems. But I do like Marabou. They've got some nice colors. So those go down. I bring out that mixative, which is the gold metallic, and it has some particles in it, particulate, that gives it that nice gold shine. And it has a little ball inside, and if, like anything that has a little ball inside it, that little ball's got to be shaking around for quite some time. So you want to shake it a lot, and less is more with the metallics, particularly in this technique. So I'm just going to put a couple of drops down, and then I'm showing you this tiny little quilling bottle that I've got the isopropyl alcohol in. And I'm just putting a bit of the isopropyl alcohol down on top as well. You can mix it with the blending solution, it doesn't matter. But again, the reason I'm using the blending solution in this particular case is because I'm using a mixative, which has a metallic mica flake in it. And as I understand it, there's a resin in the blending solution that helps to coat the flakes, the metallic flakes in the mixative, and it keeps the mixative, the gold mixative, adhered to your substrate. It won't come off on your fingers if you rub it afterward. If you don't use a blending solution and you've got a metallic, it tends to kind of rub off a bit. Not all of it, but it rubs off a bit. So I like to avoid that. I've also put some isopropyl alcohol in this Tim Holtz Mini Mister. And please do never put ink or the blending solution in a mister, but isopropyl alcohol is fine. The ink and the blending solution, again, have resins in them. You don't want to make them airborne. You should also be looking at wearing a mask, glasses if need be, ventilator, whatever it is that keeps you comfortable if you're not in an outdoor or very well ventilated space. And some people are more sensitive to alcohol inks and the things that are in them, as well as blending solution and even isopropyl alcohol. So you should be mindful of that. I don't do more than 1 or 2 projects at most in a day, and very seldom do I go several days in a row making alcohol ink projects. I do have a ventilator. I use it with certain techniques, not with this one, because as you can see, all I'm doing really is just tipping the Lazy Susan back and forth and letting gravity pull those inks around. So now I've decided I want just a bit more of the magenta and also a bit more of the lavender in there, which I'll bring back in a moment. And you'll also see that some of the colors are pooling up, not necessarily all on the outside, although that tends to be where they gravitate. But what I'm hoping to achieve with this, as I would with any of the projects using this technique, is full coverage on the substrate that I'm using. So I don't really want to see white when I go to the next step of stamping. I would prefer that the entire substrate be covered with some kind of color. And the other thing that I keep in mind is that typically I'm going to be cropping the piece that I'm using. So again, this is a 6x6 piece of the craft plastic. Ordinarily, if I'm going to be doing a square card, it's 5.5 by 5.5. I'm probably going to leave at least 1/2 inch for a mat and a border and so on. So I'm going to be taking 1 inch off of each side of this card, if I'm this piece, if I'm going to be mounting it as a card, a square one. Or I may just lop off a couple of inches on one side and make it into a rectangular card. But nonetheless, I'm going to be mindful of kind of how the colors fall, where I might be considering stamping it, although that's more difficult to do until you actually get to the stamping part. But you sort of keep it in mind if you know your stamps well. And I'm really not trying to make the colors go in any particular place. I'm more aiming to take those darker colors that you can see, the sort of pools of ink that have ended up at the very edges of the card, and bring them more into the center, because as I said before, I'm more likely that I'm going to be trimming off at least one of the sides of the card, if not all 4. You just never know. So I briefly showed my airbrush. I'll be bringing that back in again, and I'm just holding the piece up so that you can get a better idea, and also so that I can kind of gauge how the inks are moving around. They're starting to get sticky, which means they're drying. So what I'm now doing is just dipping my finger, and you could use a brush for this or something else if you wish. I work pretty quickly, especially if I'm doing a tutorial. I just really want to get the point across that you can use almost any tool, and I like to use my fingers. And also keep an eye on which parts of the piece are getting less shiny. So as the alcohol ink dries, just like with any ink really, or any paint, it becomes less shiny and more flat looking. So I'm also looking for signs that it's drying, and as I said, still trying to move away some of those darker pools at the edge closer to the center. And for me personally, I'm not paying attention much to the pattern. I just want to be able to see the different colors. I do like the variations in the tones of each of the colors as well. That way you get a little bit more depth when the technique is done. It's because you have different tones of the color, right? Different shades rather. So now I'm coming back in with my airbrush. It has no paint in it. It's simply, or alcohol ink. It has just air coming out of the brush. My compressor unit, which you can't hear or see, but it is going in the background, and it is getting air pressure to force through that hose. And this just saves me from having to blow through a straw. And for those of us who've done alcohol ink or used alcohol ink for a while, that's something I don't do anymore. Is I do not advocate nor use a straw or blow through one when I'm using these inks. I'm just giving you a bit of a closer look at how things are going here. But I don't use a straw anymore because you do tend to breathe in when you're breathing out, and I don't really like the idea of breathing in some of the resins and so on. They're not good for your lungs. And here I've brought in a small, well, it's a craft dryer. It's really just a hair dryer. It's a 2-speed. It doesn't go very hot. But that's another benefit of this particular substrate, this craft plastic. It's not subject to warping like Yupo is, like Duralor and some of the other synthetics, vellum even, in fact, vellum in particular. So I could hold something quite hot up to this and it probably wouldn't warp. I use a heat tool on this to do heat embossing. That's another kind of interesting technique that you can do with stamping on an alcohol ink background. But again, this particular substrate is great for these techniques because it accepts heat very well. And for this technique, the other reason I like this craft plastic is because in this technique, we're stripping away ink that we are putting down in order to see the impression. And so the craft plastic happens to be one of those plastics. There's a closer look again, just so you get an idea of all the different variety of textures and colors and movement in that piece. And so the craft plastic will go right back down to white. It cleans up incredibly well. So just to demonstrate that, and also what I was talking about with the press and seal on the Lazy Susan, I'm going to take a clean paper towel. In a moment I'll clean the back of that piece that I've just finished. If I was mounting that piece, say putting a mat in front of it and putting it in a frame, I would definitely want the back of it to be cleaned off entirely, all of the extra dribbles of ink. And on some substrates, you wouldn't be able to do that. I couldn't do it because it would have stained the substrate. Yupo tends to be like that, and so on. And this particular one, I laid down a piece of paper towel so that my piece, although I would like to think it's fully dry, it's not quite. I don't want it to stick to the Lazy Susan. So I just put that paper towel down. I just put a little bit of isopropyl alcohol on the paper towel, and I'm just going over it very lightly. And as we keep going to clean pieces of towel, and you can put the alcohol right down on the substrate too, which gives you a nice bit there to work with. But you'll see it comes off very quickly and very thoroughly. So it leaves a really nice clean back. And as I say, if you're going to do pieces where you plan to mat and frame them, you may want to put some information, the date, you may even want to sign the back, or put the name of the piece on the back. It's entirely up to you, but it's really nice to do that, for me anyway, when there's a really clean background. So that's another reason why I really like this particular substrate. So in a couple of minutes, I'll have this cleaned up as I hit my lamp 2 or 3 times and get all the wrong settings. And yeah, it makes it very, very quick work. And when I pull this away from the paper towel, it is going to stick a little bit. I shouldn't go on to the next step with stamping when it's still a little bit damp like this. I really should leave it for a couple of hours or overnight. I did try to dry it with the hair dryer, but I would recommend to you that you allow it to completely dry. It shouldn't really take hours and hours, but if you've got a lot of ink sort of bunked up into little pools, the dark areas, they can take a bit longer. They can be a bit stubborn that way. So that's another thing, is that I try not to let the ink pool up too much because of that. I like it to be spread out so that it dries fairly quickly. So in this case, I've taken out the stamp pad, or the stamp platform rather. Made sure again that it's set for a rubber stamp. The lid on this one opens and then is actually removed and turned around if it's a clear stamp. but I made sure it was for rubber. Then I'm bringing out that Glorious Garden large stamp, and I'm going to place the piece that I've just done with the alcohol ink on it right square into the corner, so that if I have to stamp it twice or even 3 times, and in this case you'll see that I do it twice, I know exactly where it needs to be positioned in order to get the stamp back on it where it was. Now, if you have to do it twice or 3 times and the stamp happens to move a tiny bit, unless you're going for an absolutely impeccably precise stamp design, it's not going to matter too much because you'll see at the end, and if you've seen any of the other pieces that I've done, although they're quite crisp and they come out very well, as does this one, if you doubled up the lines a tiny bit, you probably won't notice too much. And that's a factor, I think, of it being the white on the dark background, and your eyes just don't see it quite as clearly. Now, again, it depends on the style of stamp that you're using. It depends on the outcome that you want. That might be very bad advice if you're looking for something that's very clean and specific. So I've positioned the stamp, I moved it around. I found a place where that big flower would be relatively in the middle, so that when I do crop this piece, that flower will be somewhere, at least partially, if not wholly, in the feature panel. And so I position it on the top of the lid just by shutting it and opening it again, and I take out the Lift ink. I'm just rubbing it across the stamp to make sure that the ink actually bonds to all parts of the stamp, and then I go back and do what most stampers do and sort of pat it and move it and turn the pad around and try to keep an even amount of pressure on the back of the pad with my fingers so that it's hitting all the high points on the stamp. I do realize that I'm going over where the stamp isn't going to hit that substrate. If you're more frugal than I am, then by all means just stop where the stamp would stop. And again, because you're going to be trimming off the sides of it, potentially you may not want to go right to the edge. So my method for getting a really nice impression, particularly with this pad, this stamp platform, is to first push along the top, and then when I turn it over, there's a pad there that is actually soft, and I either use the palm of my other hand, which I'm doing here, and press my 2 palms together over various parts of the stamp, or I put the platform on my knee and I let my knee push in from behind, and then I use the palm of one of my hands to push against it. So you're always getting pressure from the top and the bottom, particularly again on a very detailed stamp, or when you're having problems getting an impression just using it the regular way where you're pushing from the top. I suggest that you carefully pinch it together and, as I say, put your hand underneath or a knee or something. So I'm taking my time with this, and I'm going back and again just pushing down all over the stamp in hopes that I have not only a uniform impression all over, but that it's enough to actually remove the amount of ink that I'm hoping to remove, which would be to take it back pretty much to white. So as I pull the lid up, it's sticking a bit to the substrate, and you can see the ink that's left on the stamp. That's what's been pulled off of that craft plastic, and I move the craft plastic right back into the corner just in case I need to re-stamp it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I do end up stamping it twice. I'm holding it up because you can just barely, and I'm sorry about the glare, but you can just start to see the white coming through. And at that point, if you can see the white, then what you want to do is take out a clean paper towel, check where the magnets are. You can remove them if you want because you know where to place them back in again, but I'm just going to leave them in place, and I'm going to take that brayer or roller and I'm going to go with a fair bit of pressure and trying to avoid the magnets, and I'm going to go over that image wherever it's been stamped, and that will remove at least the first part of the ink that has not come off with the stamp itself. You can see a small amount on the paper towel. And just for demonstration purposes, actually you could stamp the stamp back down now on a plain piece of paper, stick it up in the corner and push it down, and you'll get an impression of what the stamp's picked up. I'm just going to show you what the stamp picks up on the back of this paper towel. So a fair bit more than what I took off of the substrate. But as you can see, it still left a bit of the ink on the stamp, and I'll be removing that later with the StazOn. It's a product to remove solvent inks from stamps and so on. And you do need to use that after you've used the Lift ink. It is a very corrosive product, so you need to remove it really well from your stamps when you're done using it. I'm showing here that a bit more of the white impression has come up from the stamped impression, and so now I'm going in with a clean paper towel. Now that I've brayered it, I'm going just to blot it, and I'm sort of going in a grid, essentially just covering the entire piece by doing a bit, and then I should make sure that the towel that I'm using is fairly clean, because otherwise really all I'm doing is picking up the ink and putting it back down again. So it's probably not taking a whole bunch of it off, but I do check it from, yeah, it didn't take a lot off. And so what I'll do is come back in a third time, and now I've got another clean part of the paper towel, and I'm going to go in sort of a circular light buffing motion. And don't do it too hard, but what it does is, again, it removes that sort of the last layer, if you will, of whatever ink has been stamped and has been removed from the colored substrate. So I'm going to go over this once in circular motions and keep cleaning, and I'll show you how much more of the white has come out and how much more of the pattern. So it starts becoming even more interesting looking. It just adds more and more texture. And as I'm doing this, I'm just kind of keeping an eye out on what part of it is lifting, what part of it is not. I don't really want to go overboard with white, but what I'm hoping for is to be able to see quite a bit of the detail from this very detailed stamp. And because the more detail you can see in white, of course, the easier it is when you're looking at it to actually be able to tell what it is you're looking at. You can also see, maybe not as well at this point, perhaps as we move along, but you'll see where, because of the different colors and the different tones that are in the colors, it really gives a lot of depth and dimension and just a very, very nice final appearance. I really have not found any color combination or stamp, for that matter, that I didn't like when it all came together. And I would say, as I'm doing in this tutorial, to take your time, don't be in a rush. The first 2 or 3 times that I tried doing this was several months ago, and although I watched Tim Holtz do demos, and I think I'd watched a couple of other people, I just was, I don't know, too impatient, I guess, too excited. I don't know, it didn't work out very well. And I watched videos again, I watched tutorials and demos, I waited, and then I picked it up with sort of the attitude that it was a process. It's not something that happens like with stamping, and maybe that was my expectation was just a bit too high there. But so what I'm going to do now that I've buffed it off is I've decided I will go back and do another impression. And whether I was going to do another impression with the Lift ink or not, I need to use that StazOn ink remover. It's a solvent ink remover. And so you can see that I just put a bit over the entire stamp, and I'm just wiping it back for now with a dry paper towel just to take off the residual ink. At the very end, once I'm done using the stamp, not only will I clean it off again with some of the StazOn ink remover, I'll also wash it with water at the very end, just to make sure there's nothing corrosive, because it'll start wearing on the stamp, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going back in to stamp it one more time. I've left the stamp in place. I want to make sure the magnets are in the right position. I'm going to go back and restamp with the Lift ink. Gotta get these names right. And now that the stamp is seasoned, quote unquote, in other words, it's already stamped, I don't have to wipe the the stamp pad all over it. I'm patting it just like you would if you were stamping any other type of ink. And I'm going to go back and do exactly what I did before. I'm going to go back from the front. I'm going to put some pressure on from the back and the front at the same time. And I'm really just going to take my time doing this, and I'm not in a rush at the end of all of this to um, open up the stamp door either, because I want to be sure that as much of the Lift ink product as possible has gone from the stamp onto the substrate and is doing its magic and breaking down the alcohol ink. I'm sorry I went out of the picture there for a moment. And again, it sticks a little bit, but a little less than what it did the first time, just because there's a little less ink for it to stick to. And we'll start the same process. I've moved one of the magnets over a bit, but again, just to repeat, so you're going to give it a good go with the brayer on a nice clean paper towel or some other kind of clean cloth that you've got, just so that you can pick up that extra ink. I'll do it twice for good measure, just because we did that whole extra coat. And then I'm going to go back with a paper towel, blot it with a clean one. I'll give you a show so you can see how much more is now removed, and the image is clearer, especially on the darker parts of the ink that were on that craft plastic. So I'm going in with, again, paper towel. I'm not even going to blot this particular one because I'm doing it so lightly, the buffing, then I'm just really taking off the very end of the ink that's going to come back with this impression. So it's not going to be long, and I'll have decided that I have done enough. There's enough of the impression showing. And now in the back of the piece is nice and clean, even though you won't be able to see it once it's mounted onto a card, but nonetheless, at least you've got some tips that way. So I'll take that out and I will clean up my stamp really well and rinse it off with water at the very end. And this is ready to mount. You'll see the finished card you saw at the very beginning of this tutorial. I'm going to show you this one again at the very end, and a couple of others like this one that was done just in a solid blue ink. And I'll let you enjoy this, and the one following this, it's been done in purple and golds. So just again to give you an idea of the different variations with the different inks and some of my favorite stamps. Thanks for joining me.